Are the holidays stealing your joy? You can get it back. Jesus can show you how.
So I really like that Christmas version of Crown Him with Many Crowns. What did you all think? That was pretty good, huh? A good way to remember what this season is all about. In fact, we're kind of getting to the end of this season, and today we're wrapping up a series that we've been in for the holiday season called Joy to Your World. And kind of the big idea behind the series is this. The Christmas season, the holiday season, is a season that comes with an expectation, and the expectation is that we are going to experience a certain level and a certain amount of joy, and yet there's this reality that we've been teasing out in this season, which is this: even though we all want joy, there are things during the holiday season and really all year long that can kind of, annoy us. Have you ever experienced this before? Maybe you're kind of breathing a sigh of relief that the holiday season is pretty much over because your calendar was so packed, you didn't get joy for Christmas, you got exhaustion for Christmas. Or maybe you're kind of getting to that month that is the most stressful month for you of the year because you spent a lot of money last month buying gifts for people that you didn't even really like, but you kind of thought you should buy gifts for them, and now you have credit card bills that you can't pay, and you didn't get joy for Christmas, you just got more debts. Kind of the big question in this series is this: how do we experience the joy that the holiday season seems to want to promise, but can't always seem to deliver? How do we experience the joy that we all desire, not only during the holidays, but every day of our lives? And so over the past several weeks in this series, we've been looking at what I call are some key ingredients for joy, things that we all need if we actually want to kind of create a recipe that brings us joy in our lives. And this weekend, as we wrap up this series, we come to our final key ingredients, which is the key ingredients of wisdom. If you want to experience joy in your life, one of the things that you need is you need some wisdom in your head and also wisdom in your hearts. Now, Pastor Kyle mentioned this a little bit earlier in the service. Yesterday was a day in church tradition known as Epiphany. And Epiphany is one of those moments in church tradition that actually commemorates an event in the Bible. It commemorates a moment when some men from far away, traditionally we think of there being three of them, but actually historically there were probably many more of them. There was a whole cavalcade full of them. They travel from a place that is far away, way east of Jerusalem, to the city of Jerusalem, and they're looking for this king that they can deliver gifts to, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, traditionally, the church has called this group of men, this cavalcade of men, wise men. But here's a question. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I've thought about this. What was it exactly that made these men so wise? I mean, why is it exactly that we call you call these men wise men? Is it just because they brought the King Jesus gifts? Because I brought lots of gifts to lots of people before, and nobody has ever accused me of being wise. In fact, there have been a few gifts that I've gotten from my wife Melody that when she opened them, you could just tell by the look on her face that the gift was profoundly unwise. So, what was it that made these wise men so wise? Here's what I want to do. I actually want to walk through and work through the story of the wise men. We find it in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. And I just want to try to figure out what made these wise men so wise, because if we can figure out what made them so wise, then maybe we can get some of their wisdom into our lives that will help us experience joy. And so, this is the story of the wise men. From Matthew chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, and just to set a little bit of context here, this would have been probably about a year and a half after Jesus was born, and so think of this as toddler Jesus, all right? Jesus is wandering around doing all the little things that little boys do. About a year and a half after he was born, during the time of King Herod, and we'll get back to King Herod in just a second, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. And this word magi is a word that describes what the church has traditionally referred to as wise men. And so wise men from the east came to the city of Jerusalem, and they went to King Herod's palace with a question. And the question was this: where is the one who has been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Our story begins with some wise men who have traveled from the east to the city of Jerusalem. They found this king named Herod, and I got to give you a little bit of background on King Herod. King Herod was actually the king of Israel during the time of Matthew 2, during the first century. And King Herod was not only the king of Israel, he actually had a technical title. He was called the King of the Jews because he ruled and reigned over all of the Jews who lived in the region and in the nation of Israel at this time. Now, history has come to call Herod not just the king of the Jews or King Herod, but King Herod the Great. Because in a lot of ways, in so many ways, Herod really was great. In fact, about 25 years before Matthew 2 takes place, there was this great famine in the nation of Israel. And a lot of people could not buy food because food prices were very inflated. A lot of people were dying. And so what Herod did was he had this massive collection of gold plates that he actually melted down, and he used the proceeds from the gold plates to buy food for people who couldn't buy it for themselves. And he won the favor of a lot of the Jews in Israel at the time who began to consider him great. In fact, Herod was also really great at public works projects. He built a theater in the city of Jerusalem. He also built an amphitheater. He built a hippodrome a little bit south in the city of Jericho. A hippodrome is a racetrack. He also built a massive and marvelous palace for himself. You know what Herod named Herod's palace? The Herodium. He actually named it after himself because he didn't have a lot of problems in like the self-confidence department, okay? He loved to do that. He also built a whole seaport town called the Caesarea Maritima. Herod wanted Israel to have a little access to some of the traveling merchants who would come in by sea, so he just built himself an artificial harbor that he called the Caesarea Maritima. He built a city called Mamre, and then finally, the project that he was probably most famous for was he rebuilt, refurbished, and expanded and made better than ever the temple in Jerusalem. And so Herod did a lot of great things. But for all of the great things that Herod did, Herod also had a bit of a dark side. In fact, more than that, Herod had a sinister side. The older he got, the more paranoid and worried he became that someone was going to try to take his throne and steal his name of the King of the Jews. And so whenever Herod suspected that someone might be after his throne, he did everything he could to take them down and take them out. Herod actually married 10 different women over the course of his life, most of whom were political trophy wives. He actually banished his first wife because he was concerned that she was going to take his throne. He executed his second wife because he was concerned that she was going to take his throne as well. He also killed one of his mothers-in-law and one of his brothers-in-law because he was concerned that they were trying to take his throne. And he killed 3 of his own kids, 3 of his own sons, because he was concerned that they were going to try to claim his throne and claim his title as the King of the Jews. Herod was worried that someone was always out to get him. And so you can kind of imagine that when these wise men come from a faraway place from the east to Herod's palace, and they have a question about a king that they call the King of the Jews, which is Herod's title, when they come to Herod and they ask in Matthew 2, verse 2, where is the one who has been born the King of the Jews? You can imagine that that question puts Herod on edge more than just a little bit. In fact, in the very next verse, in Matthew 2, verse 3, it says that when Herod heard this, he was disturbed. And not only was he disturbed, all of Jerusalem was disturbed with him, because by this time, Herod's reputation as kind of a vicious and jealous and paranoid ruler had gotten out, and everybody knew that when Herod wasn't happy, nobody was happy. But of course, the wise men, they're not from the region of Jerusalem. They're not from the nation of Israel. They've come from far away to the city of Jerusalem, and so they don't know any of the background on Herod. All they know is that they have seen this star in the sky, and that star has signaled the arrival of a new king of the Jews. Now, this kind of begs another question, which is this. Where in the world did the wise men get the idea from that a star in the sky would signal the arrival of a newborn king? I mean, have you ever wondered that? It wasn't like the wise men were from round these parts. They were from hundreds of miles east of the city of Jerusalem. Well, it turns out that about 600 years before Matthew 2 and before these wise men show up at the palace of Herod the Great, there lived this little Jewish boy, or actually this Jewish young man, in the city of Jerusalem. His name was Daniel. And Daniel had three friends. You may have heard of these friends before. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, anybody know the name of the last one? Abednego. They were all living in the city of Jerusalem. Everything was going along fine. They were growing up as good little Jewish boys until the year 605 BC. Because in the year 605 BC, there was this ruler who lived in the east, in the city of Babylon. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar was on a nation-building campaign to try to build up his empire of Babylon. And so he swept into the city of Jerusalem, he ransacked the place, and what he did was he basically took the best and the brightest of the young people from the city of Jerusalem far back, far east to his city of Babylon to serve in his royal court. Because what King Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do was he was trying to create a royal court for himself full of the best and the brightest and the wisest people in the world. And Nebuchadnezzar saw Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and said, those are guys that I want in my corner. Those are guys that I need as a part of my court. And Nebuchadnezzar's court really was impressive. In fact, we read about it in Daniel 2, verse 2. It had people like magicians and enchanters and sorcerers and astrologers. In other words, people who had mysterious insight into a lot of things. And people who had mysterious power to do a lot of things. Now, there's actually one category of folks in that court that I want you to pick up on. It's the first category of folks, the magicians. The word magician actually comes from an old Greek word. It's the word magos. And what's interesting about this word is that 600 years after Daniel 2, verse 2, some magi show up. And in Matthew 2, verse 2, or in Matthew 2, verse 1, these magi are actually in Greek magos. It turns out that Daniel and his three little Jewish friends were part of King Nebuchadnezzar's court of ancient wise men. And what's even more fascinating is that Daniel and his three friends actually proved themselves to be wiser than all the other wise men, all the other magi in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. Daniel 1 verse 20 says that in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them to be 10 times wiser, 10 times better than all the other magicians, all the other magi and enchanters in his whole kingdom. In fact, Daniel is so smart that Daniel actually eventually gets a promotion. And in Daniel 5 verse 11, he becomes the chief or the teacher of the magi. He becomes the professor for the enchanters and the astrologers and diviners. Daniel begins to teach all the wise men of this ancient Babylonian court of wise guys. And so you kind of got to wonder, what did Daniel teach all of these guys? Well, he taught them all his ancient Jewish wisdom, all the stuff that he had learned growing up as a little kid in the city of Jerusalem. He taught them about the commands of God, what was right and what was wrong. He also taught them about the prophecies of God. The promises that God made about his work that he was going to do in this world. And there is one prophecy in particular that Daniel had at his disposal, at his fingertips, that's really fascinating. It's an old prophecy from the book of Numbers, 24, verse 17. It's a prophecy about a king that is to come. And this king's arrival is going to be signaled by a star that's going to be in the sky. It's going to come out at Jacob. And when you see the star in the sky, that's going to be the signal that a scepter, the thing a king holds in his hand, that's going to be the signal that a scepter is arising right out of the nation of Israel. And so for 600 years, All these magi, all these wise men from the empire of Babylon held on to the training and the learning that they received from a little Jewish exile named Daniel. And now, 600 years after Daniel gave them this prophecy, they see a star in the sky, and the Magi believe that it has signaled the arrival of a new king for the Jews. And so they decide that they're going to make a journey. Now, I don't know about you, but that strikes me as pretty wise. But if the wise men here are being very wise, you know what Herod is being? Herod is being very, very worried. Because he doesn't want any king being a threatening, menacing menace to him. And so what Herod does is he gathers all of the religious leaders that he knows from the Jews. Matthew 2, verse 4, he calls together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law. And he asks them a question. He asks them where the Messiah is to be born. Now, the question that Herod asks the wise men is actually kind of a fascinating question, because when the wise men first come to Herod and they ask him a question, here's the question they ask him in Matthew 2, verse 2. They say, "Where is the one who has been born, the King of the Jews?" But when Herod hears that question, and he gets worried about that question, and he gathers all the Jewish religious leaders together to talk to them about that question, he changes the question the Magi have asked him just a little bit. Because the Magi ask him a question about a king of the Jews. When Herod repeats their question, he doesn't ask about a king, he asks about a Messiah. He asks where the Messiah in Matthew 2, verse 4 is to be born. And the difference in Herod's question is really important. Because the Messiah in ancient Jewish thinking was indeed a king. But he wasn't just any old king. The ancient Jews believed that one day God was going to send not only a king, but the king, his final king who was going to rule and reign over a kingdom that was going to last forever. This king wasn't just going to be any old king in a long line of kings. He was going to be a king who was anointed and appointed by God. And they called this final king the Messiah. And Herod has a sneaking suspicion that when these wise men come to him with a question about this king, the king that they're asking about isn't just another king. He is God's final king. But here's what you need to understand about Herod. Herod doesn't care. Herod doesn't care that this could be God's final king. Herod doesn't care that this king could be the king who has been anointed and appointed by God himself. Because Herod knows that if this is God's king, that is going to make Herod a footnote in the history of God's final king. And Herod will be a footnote to no one. Because nobody can be greater than Herod the Great. And so he calls in these Jewish religious leaders and he tries to get more information about this king. He asks them, where is this king going to be born? And the Jewish religious leaders in Matthew 2, verse 5, they say, well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem, in Judea. There's this old prophet, his name is Micah. He lived 700 years before, and he wrote these words, Matthew 2, verse 6, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you is going to come a ruler, and it's going to be God's final ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel." And so Herod hears that, and he thinks, well, okay, Bethlehem's only about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. I can get down there. But of course, Herod has a problem because Bethlehem's not a big town, but it's big enough. And to try to find one king in a whole city full of people, that's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. And so Herod has to, kind of make his pool a little bit smaller so that he can search for this king a little bit better. And so he dismisses the Jewish religious leaders, and then, verse 7, he calls in the Magi, the wise men secretly. And he finds out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. Because here's Herod's thinking. If there's a star in the sky that signals the arrival of the Messiah, whenever that star appeared, that's when God's Messiah was born. And so if he just knew how long the star has been in the sky, he could figure out how old the Messiah was, which would make the Messiah easier to find, because now he had a ballpark age to find this new king. But even that is a little hard for Herod to figure out. And so what he finally decides to do is he finally decides to send the Magi on a little mission. Verse 8, he sends them to Bethlehem. And he says to them, why don't you go? And why don't you search carefully for this child? And as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and slaughter him. Worship him. Well, after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose, it begins to do something amazing. It travels. It starts moving through the sky and dragging them behind it. And then, after it travels and goes ahead of them, all of a sudden, it stops. Right over the place where the child Messiah was. And when they saw the star, they were just overjoyed by what this star had done. Over the years, there's been a lot of debate and dispute over, what the star was. Was it a supernova? Was it an alignment of planets? Was it something like a comet? Now, I have my own preferred theory on this, but this much I do know. Whatever the star was, this star ultimately was a miracle of God. Think about it. A star that not only rises, but moves and then stops. God was doing something miraculous here. Verse 11, on coming to the house, the wise men saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and they presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense in the ancient world, that was used to help folks with respiratory diseases. So you would give someone frankincense if they had something like bronchitis or a cold or asthma or something like that. Myrrh was actually used as an antiseptic. So you would give it to them when they had cuts, scrapes, bruises, things like that. And so these wise men are incredibly wise, because here's toddler Jesus, right? He's 1.5 years old. And what do they give him? Here's some frankincense for all the germs and colds you're going to get. And here's some myrrh because you're a toddler, which means you're going to be getting cuts and scrapes and bruises everywhere. We don't want it to get infected. We'll give you some myrrh. And by the way, here's some gold to start a college fund. Talk about great gifts for toddler-aged Jesus. I was thinking about this. The wise men actually have a couple of things beyond just their good gift-giving ability that make them truly wise. And I actually want to spend the balance of our time together this morning just talking about the things that the wise men have that make them truly wise. The wise men have two things that when you put them together, they actually equal and create wisdom. Here's what the wise men have. Okay? They have knowledge on the one hand, and they have action on the other hand. And when you put those two things together, that is how you become wise. Now, you can't just have one or the other if you want wisdom. Have you ever been in one of those classes where you kind of sit through it and it's so boring and you wonder, when in the world am I going to use this in real life? Anybody ever sat through one of those classes? For me, it was high school trigonometry. Okay, they were showing me all of these formulas that I did not understand, that I knew I was never going to use because I was not going to be a NASA space scientist. I just wanted to be able to balance my checkbook. And so I was getting knowledge in trigonometry, but that knowledge was not wisdom because I was never going to put it into action. It was just information that I have long since forgotten. I knew it once upon a time. Conversely, there are some people who are big on action, but they take a lot of action without a lot of knowledge. We call these people ready, fire, aim people. Anybody ever met someone like that? Who just does stuff without thinking about it. In church, there are these kind of people who are always doing certain actions. And then when you ask them, okay, why do we do it this way? The answer is because we've what? Always done it that way. That's a lot of action, but that's not wisdom because it's action without knowledge. You need knowledge and action to have wisdom, and the wise men have both. They have knowledge that they have held on to for 600 years about a star that's going to rise in the sky that's going to signal the arrival of a king. They've passed that down from generation to generation, from century to century. But then here's the key. When they actually see the star in the sky, they spring into action. And they make a journey 500 miles west from Babylon to the city of Jerusalem. These wise men are incredibly wise. But these wise men are not the only wise people in this story. There's actually another wise guy in this story. And the problem with this other wise guy in this story, this wise guy, besides these wise men, is that if you understand who it is, it makes this story very unsettling. You know who the other wise guy in this story is? Herod. Herod. I mean, think about it. He's a really wise guy. He has knowledge. In fact, not only does he have knowledge, he seeks knowledge. When he hears this rumor about this king of the Jews who's been born, this Messiah, what does he do? He gathers in all the religious leaders and he says, okay, I need to know what the prophets say about where the Messiah is to be born. He's seeking knowledge. And then when that knowledge isn't enough, he calls the Magi in and he says, okay, I need to know when the star in the sky appeared so that I can figure out how old this king is. He not only has knowledge, he seeks knowledge, and then make no mistake about it, he puts his knowledge into action. You know, by the time the wise men are done meeting with Herod and talking to Herod, they begin to get the heebie-jeebies, okay, about Herod, because he's kind of a creep. And actually, after they go and see Jesus, they're warned in a dream not to go back to Herod's palace. So they go back to Babylon by a different route, by another way. And when Herod finds out that he's been duped by the wise men, he becomes furious. And so here's what he does. He takes the knowledge that he has and he puts it into action. Matthew 2, verse 16, here's what Herod does. He gives orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem. And notice this, not just in Bethlehem and its vicinity. Because Herod wants to make sure he doesn't miss killing this king of the Jews. So it's Bethlehem and surrounding areas that Herod gives an order to kill all boys who are 2 years old and under in accordance with the time of the star and its appearance in the sky that he has learned from the Magi. Herod's not going to let this king get away. And actually, he would have succeeded in killing this king if Mary and Joseph wouldn't have taken Jesus and fled out of Bethlehem and the surrounding areas. Herod has knowledge, and he puts his knowledge into action, which by definition makes him wise. So, here's the question we need to wrestle with a little bit. If both Herod and the wise men are wise, what's the difference between their wisdom? Or I'll ask the question more provocatively. Is there a difference between their wisdom? The answer to the question is yes. There's a difference. But it's not in the knowledge that they have. Both Herod and the wise men have the same knowledge. They know where the Messiah is supposed to be born because of the prophecy. They figure out how old the Messiah might be because of the star in the sky. They have all the same knowledge. And it's not in whether they decide to act, because both decide to act in their own ways. The difference in their wisdom actually comes in why they decide to act. Because here's why Herod acts. Herod acts for the sake of Herod. Herod cares about Herod. And Herod wants to protect his power and his kingdom and his glory and his rulership and his legacy. He wants to protect his title of the King of the Jews. Herod acts to make sure that Herod is going to be okay. The wise men act for a completely different reason. They don't act for the sake of the wise men. They act for the sake of a prophecy and for the sake of a baby who they believe is a new king from God of the Jews and for the world. Herod, he uses his wisdom to bless and benefit himself. He uses his wisdom to take care of Herod. The wise men, they use their wisdom to bless and benefit somebody else. To bring somebody else gifts to celebrate his birth and his arrival in his kingdom. Now, here's where the story gets really relevant for us, because here's the question we need to ask ourselves. If Herod acts and uses his wisdom to bless and benefit himself, and the wise men act and they use their wisdom to bless and benefit somebody else, here's the question we need to ask. How do we use our wisdom? How do you use your wisdom? Now, before you answer that question too quickly, and you go, well, I use my wisdom to bless and benefit somebody else, because, Zach, I know where you're going with this, and that is the correct answer, and I'm in church, right? I'm not supposed to be selfish and use my wisdom on myself. I'm supposed to use it for somebody else. Is that true? Forget the church answer for a second, okay? In the real world, in real circumstances, how do you really use your actual wisdom? Like, what's the real answer to that question? Because, come on, we all know the way the world works. If you don't watch out for yourself, who's going to watch out for you? Nobody. If you don't take care of yourself, who's going to take care of you? Nobody. If you don't defend yourself against people who want to hurt you, who's going to defend you? Nobody. And sometimes you just got to use your wisdom to take care of yourself. We actually have an old saying that reflects this. If you fool me once, shame on you. If you fool me twice, shame on who? Me. Because come on, you got to watch out for yourself. Otherwise, you're just a fool. You got to know how to take care of yourself. Because there's a lot of bad people in that world out there. And that's just the way the world really is. And so let me ask you again. How do you use your wisdom? Really? So there's this fascinating conversation that Jesus has with his disciples a little bit later in the Gospel of Matthew. This is in Matthew chapter 10. Jesus is no longer toddler Jesus. He's grown-up Jesus, and he's sending his disciples on a mission into the real world to preach what he's been preaching, to do what he's been doing, to heal people, to help people. But as he sends his disciples on this mission into the real world, he gives his disciples a warning. And here's the warning he gives them in Matthew 10, verse 16. He says to his guys, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. In other words, you've heard of a dog-eat-dog world? Well, the real world is worse than that. It's not dog-eat-dog, it's wolf-eat-sheep. And fellas, you guys are so naive and so weak and so fluffy that, you're like sheep. And if you're not careful, the world is going to eat you alive. And you got to know that. You got to know the way the world works. And so Jesus says, let me help you out. Be as shrewd as snakes. A little bit of technical work here for you. New Testament written in Greek. And the Greek word for shrewd is the word phronimos, which is actually the Greek word for wise or for wisdom. In fact, some translations of the Bible translate Jesus' words here as be as wise as snakes. But I like the translation shrewd because it gets at what Jesus is getting at. Because you know what shrewdness is? Shrewdness is wisdom you use on yourself. Shrewdness is wisdom you use for yourself, to protect yourself, to help yourself, to guard yourself against people who would hurt you and harm you and destroy you. That's what it means to be shrewd. And Jesus says in the world out there, that's the wisdom of the world, and so you better get wise to the world's wisdom, because if you don't, you're going to be eaten like a wolf eats a sheep. And so you better be shrewd. Got it? Now, here's the thing with Jesus. This would be the point in the real world, right? Just to live in the real world where we would want him to be through. But Jesus never quite does what we want him to. Because Jesus isn't done yet talking to his disciples about how to live out there in the real world. He continues. And he says, in this world that is wolf eat sheep, in this world that I'm sending you into, like sheep among wolves, I want you to be shrewd as snakes. But here's what else I want you to be. I want you to be as innocent as doves. One more Greek word that I'm done for the day. I promise, okay? Greek word for innocence. It's the word akeraios. Keraios means mixed. You put an A in front of it that turns it into its opposite. And so this is a word that means unmixed. Here's what Jesus is getting at. He says, be wise to the wisdom of the world, but don't get mixed up in it. Because, my disciples, for you, I have a different kind of wisdom. For you, I have a wiser kind of wisdom. Not a wisdom that is shrewd and self-interested, but a wisdom that is loving and self-sacrificing. That's the wisdom that I want to give to you. That's the wisdom that I want you to share with the world. And those are the kinds of wise people that I want you to be. In fact, just to put an exclamation point on this, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 30. Paul writes about the kind of wise man that Jesus was, and Paul says that Christ Jesus has become, and then I want you to pick up on these next two words, for us, wisdom from God. Who does Jesus use his wisdom for? to bless and benefit himself? Or does he use his wisdom to bless and benefit us? Does Jesus use his wisdom in his own self-interest, or in a way that is self-sacrificing, even when being self-sacrificing means sacrificing yourself on a cross? How does Jesus use his wisdom? And what does that say about the way that we should use our wisdom? You know, no matter how you use your wisdom, you'll get something from wisdom. If you use your wisdom shrewdly, if you're self-interested, and if you use your wisdom to bless and benefit yourself, you will get something. You will get something in return. If you are shrewd and you outmaneuver all your colleagues and coworkers and you get the promotion and they don't, you'll get something. If you are shrewd with your money and you save and you scrimp and you don't give a lot and you keep it all for yourself, you'll get something. You know what you'll get? You'll get results. You will. You'll get results. That kind of wisdom works. If you're looking for results, just be shrewd. But if you use your wisdom in a self-sacrificing way to bless and benefit other people, you'll get something too. Here's what you'll get. If you use your wisdom about your husband or wife to give them a gift that they're going to love, you'll get a smile on their face and maybe a few tears in their eyes in return. If you use your wisdom to help people who can't help themselves and who can't protect themselves, if you go down to the soup kitchen and use your very limited, or I should say my very limited culinary skills to make mac and cheese, which I hope I don't mess up, right? But I spend some time to talk to people who are struggling and maybe even pray with them. Here's what I'll get. I'll get a look of hope in their face, and maybe even I'll just leave a little bit of impact on their lives. You see, when you use wisdom in a way that is self-interested, you get results. But when you use wisdom in a way that is self-sacrificing, do you know what you get in return? Joy. Joy. You get joy from others because of the way that you have blessed and benefited others. So, let me ask you again. How are you going to use your wisdom? One more verse, just one more. Back to Matthew 2. When the wise men use their wisdom because they want to bless and benefit a newborn king of the Jews, when they make a 500-mile journey to follow a star that they first heard about 600 years ago, and when they finally get to the place where the star lands so that they can give their gifts, what happens in Matthew 2, verse 11? On coming to the house, and when they saw the star, they were what? Overjoyed. Because that's what wisdom that blesses and benefits others gives. So, here's the invitation. Choose how you use your wisdom wisely. And if you want to know how to use your wisdom wisely, here's how you do that. Just look at how Jesus used his wisdom.